Yeah.
I'd have to talk to like individual players more to understand like, okay, what do you think about this? And then I think another part of it is like players don't want to share their strategies. Players don't want to share their thought process, and they don't want to not only not be public about it anyways, but they kind of like I've had coaches before where it's like everything you learn should be a secret. Like, why are you sharing strategies with other teams, or why are you sharing this with other teams, other players? Because that's going to give them a competitive advantage.
And that was Darshan talking to LS last night in between games about not just the in-house games and how they're going, but certain mentalities and the way League of Legends has been approached by several players and coaches in the LCS and NA over the past decade. Darshan's been in the LCS, a part of League of Legends on a professional level since the early days back when he was on Coast. And LS, recent mega celebrity within the competitive League of Legends landscape, has his history in StarCraft, has been in Korea for years now, and is one of the great minds approaching competitive League of Legends and itemization in game state and trying to figure out how to play the optimal way. That clip that I just ran through was in the midst of the in-house coaching session that LS was providing Darshan in between the games. And what I want to focus on is a little add in there piece from Darshan. He highlights how certain coaches or players wanted their teammates and players to keep their knowledge a secret or to never share anything, uh, just to keep as much competitive advantage as possible. At its foundation, at least at the first point that it's being brought forward, sounds like a good idea because you're keeping all of your secrets together in your chest, in your treasure chest. The problem is that this doesn't let your ideas get tested, and it ends up leading to a very gridlock state where no one ends up growing. It is, as I would call it, and as would probably many others call it, a famine mentality. A famine mentality is the idea that there are a limited number of resources, and the best way you can play is to acquire as many as you can and share none of your quote food. The idea being that if you have more food than everyone else, you have a greater chance of survival, or in the case of League of Legends, winning games. This idea has its merits because it would be, for example, gross if a player or coach just opened their playbook to the league, and that would just be ruin for the team and the org. But a gray area needs to be explored if anyone, including NA, is going to improve. If you're a fan of Joe Rogan, you might have actually heard him talk about this feast or famine mentality on his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. He's talked about it obviously much more in the world that he cares about, which is stand-up comedy. It used to be a very prevalent issue in the stand-up world back when media was much more limited with just TV and cable news, and we didn't have the internet. And perhaps there was also a greater mindset that was plaguing the scene. Back then, the greatest route a stand-up comic could follow would be to get yourself built up locally and then go out on the road, develop a good set, and then if you could find the right avenues or the right peaks in this very cutthroat industry that it was, you could end up on big talk shows like Johnny Carson or David Letterman show, and from there you could peak even further going into HBO specials back when HBO was the premier situation for getting great specials like Eddie Murphy's Raw, which were very uncut and explicit. And at that time, because there was only less than 100 TV channels, the bottleneck was very real. So everyone at the thick end of the bottle would just be fighting and killing each other, not helping each other to try to get better and succeed at their art or at their craft. And this provided a very cutthroat and horrible environment for the stand-up comedy scene. Openers that would be recruited in for shows would only be locals that would definitely not be anywhere near as good as the main act. Certain comics traveled and had the same act for years or even decades, and as it would stand here in 2020, we are actually blessed in the greatest era of at least stand-up comedy and entertainment, in that there are so many other avenues for media and entertainment and comics, for example, to put out their content, get audiences, and make a living off of their craft. Now, the shift that happened in the stand-up comedy scene began with the internet, and that provided a whole new way for marketing, and Dane Cook was perhaps the greatest example that a lot of us grew up with as someone who utilized the internet, utilized MySpace to branch out and go from there. But the other thing that Joe Rogan, I believe, would very much focus on, and he discussed this on his podcast several times, is that he would much rather have, and he has seen greater success in having a feast mentality, which has a entirely opposite approach to it. In this view, there's not only enough for everybody out there, but by collaborating, sharing ideas, and helping each other improve their craft, their jokes, their scene, their play, the entire scene elevated itself. A current example of this with where Joe Rogan was actually discussing with Dave Chappelle, where comic friends of his, Tom Segura and Burt Kreischer, had been using pay-per-view events where they would get COVID-safe environments and bars, something like that, with like minimal people and all the social distancing rules and masks and such. But these would be pay-per-view events that would allow them to make a living and provide exclusive content that did not have to be blocked, or they didn't have to care about certain restrictions that would come in from broadcasting bureaucracies. And so, but with this view that Joe Rogan took early on in his career, back when even it was still in the cutthroat era of the early 90s and late 80s, before the internet had really come alive, he would have have the opposite. Instead of making sure that any of his openers were less talented than him, he would almost ensure that he was taking the best talent he knew, even young up and comers, bring them with him, even if they were potentially better than him, and that would provide this much more competitive environment that if Joe's opener is doing better than him, then he's got to figure out how to either improve his jokes, get better jokes, or retire. Like, there is a requirement to improve in this environment. And it's coupled with the camaraderie. It isn't a cut-through competition situation in this feast mentality, as Joe Rogan would put it. And it is perhaps this mentality that has allowed him to become one of the greatest comics of our time, and that is its own debate. Now, the same idea needs to be approached in probably a lot of areas of life, but definitely here in the LCS. If what Darshan was describing there to LS is true and is actually a prevalent mindset across the region, then we potentially have a bunch of ideas, good or bad, bottled up in a bunch of players and coaches' minds that could hurt or help in and none of them are getting tested. None of them are being put forth, discussed, or even played out in scrims or in these in-houses, or even just on stage. Certain ideas aren't getting tested properly enough to where perhaps even coaches or other players would take them seriously. Because let's say if an idea proves valuable, then there is less likely an opportunity for another to build on or beat the idea if it's never even revealed. The belief that holding all the knowledge to gain a competitive advantage is a defeatist mindset, I believe. There are, on a broader scope, a million ideas that run through all of our heads every day. Some of those ideas could be million-dollar ideas in the terms of business ideas for products or, merchandise or imagery, entertainment, the like. And a prevalent fear that we have all heard plenty of stories about where ideas were stolen and those people that steal the ideas end up making the millions. It's a real fear, but it's not as prevalent as we think. It's really not. The great little secret about all the ideas that you come up with or others come up with, your friends come up with, and all the ideas that your trusted friends share with you that are million-dollar ideas, the great secret is that almost no one wants to do the work. The majority of people are not willing to take a good idea and then spend the years, the hours, the months, the weeks, the days just figuring out the idea, getting the manufacturing on deck, just creating the images or finding someone to do the graphic design or to get the marketing strategy just right, or just willing to try and fail over and over again on what they believe is a really good idea. Almost no one wants to really do the work. It is very risky, and only those that are willing to take risk are going to do that. And most of us are actually quite happy to sit at home and watch LCS while the 50 plus people that have decided to take risks ends up on an LCS stage, more or less. And then the next 20% that are doing 80% of the work are the top 20% of the league, such as in history, Bjergsen, Doublelift, Darshan back in his prime. Those players, those people, those coaches that are doing the extra work, the extra risk taking to make their ideas real. And the great tragedy right now, actually, in my mind, at least as a clear example, since he is one of the loudest voices we haven't seen right now, is that LS is literally throwing ideas and throwing methodologies everywhere. He's just throwing his ideas everywhere and just ejecting them directly across the globe. And it's not clear to me that his ideas are being tested or discussed seriously on the professional level. I do not have any insight or view into a lot of into any teams really. I am very much alone in my room, you know, evaluating as best I can from where I stand. But for last year, LS critiqued players, teams, orgs just across the world on item choices, on draft decisions, on meta play across the map states, what they would do with freezing, how they would destroy turrets, inhibs. If you followed LS at all, you know he is hypercritical about every inch of the game and every inch of play that he can see. And it really didn't, his critiques didn't really show up to result in a lot of adjustment in itemization or play. There's even now, actually, if you watch the in-houses and if you watch the last night, the 17th in-house play, there were still, with this entirely new reworked item system, professional players, academy or otherwise, and LCS players in these NA in-house games that were still buying Morellos when there was not a very clear active healing agent on the other team. There's still not a thorough analysis of what you're doing and why you're doing it. But it's not like LS is hard to find. It's not like LS is really hard to track down, or it's not. It's his ideas have become memes from freezing to Leandries versus Morellos. And he could be right. He could be wrong about all of his ideas. It's not really. It's not. That's not the point. Whether he's right or wrong. The point is that in a way, LS is kind of his own team, and he's the loudest voice we have right now. That could be another team or even several teams with how much. It's just clear how much he's watching and how much he's playing and how much he's seeing. He is so deep in this game that he's like several other teams combined in terms of just what he knows, what he sees, and what he can compile. You know, I don't think he has any access to scrims or anything like that, but it's just baffling. It seemed very baffling after a point, at least for NA, how few of his ideas were really tested or implemented. The only great example we saw was Licorice top lane with his Ornn just stacking and patterning his item choices so he could freeze well or he could actually provide value without being directly attacked. The blessing that comes with LS is that he does not have the stakes of a player or professional team. He actually can share all of his ideas non-stop. That's the great benefit of LS to the entire League of Legends world right now, is that he gets to have his discussions with players and teams, and he gets to try to inject his ideas and just see his ideas tested across the map. But he doesn't have the same stake or the same reason as other teams and players do to keep things secret. So he doesn't have the same challenge or issue or necessary for secrecy when it's game time. But at least right now, and teams and players need to find somewhere in the year where they're exchanging ideas. It feels so defeating to believe that teams and players are not exchanging ideas throughout the competitive season, even just base ideas of just having some sort of discussions. I can't even think of like something that would feel good, like exchanging on draft ideas or, being so, confident in your pick that you could pick, Akali into Orianna, and you could 1v1 that like by level 4 or something like that, get like a solo kill, something ridiculous. There's just not an exchange going on. It's a very stagnant situation, and no one is coming out and discussing and having conversations about the game. It was actually so great to watch LS coach Darshan in between the in-house games, educating him on at least what he thinks would be the best play for the team, for the game, for Darshan on his micro play. And that is just music and magic to my ears as both a fan of NA as well as someone who worships at the altar of discussion and discourse. You have to bring ideas to the forefront and test them through discussion, through discourse, through just putting them on the Rift and seeing if they take. And we need more of this magic, more of this music to come from our region. LS did his own discussion on this, or at least his own rebuttal to that secrecy idea that Darshan put forward that is or was a problem across players and coaches that Darshan had played with before. And LS provided a great example from the StarCraft era where Europe, China, and Korea, all the players they all exchanged and they shared ideas and they had to create counters to the counters to the counters. While NA had this same idea that's happening now, where it's like we must hoard and not share and keep all of our ideas to ourselves, and it doesn't lead to any growth, any challenging, any improvement. And it's my hope that going into 2021, we are at the beginning of a road that leads to a dramatic change in North America, in the LCS's culture. And at best, these shifting elements from in-houses to just LS even talking to Darshan, that maybe even we have just a greater improvement in our prospects on the international stage go up. Because at this point, we can only go up from here. RIP TSM.